That's not necessarily the Nazi Holocaust. The Lebensraum dealt with the conquest of Eastern Europe. As a general rule, I'm not sure what's the point of studying history if you can't compare and contrast, because that seems to me the essence of history. Typical history question in high school. Compare and contrast the French and Russian revolutions. Compare and contrast the British and the French monarchy. Comparing and contrasting is the essence of history. So then to now suddenly say that when it comes to the Nazi Holocaust, nothing can be compared and nothing can be contrasted, and it suddenly becomes a case of Holocaust denial to even compare or contrast. Well, of course you're allowed to contrast, you're allowed to say nothing compares. That seems to me to turn what should be history into some sort of religion. You're just worshiping at some totem, and the totem is called the Holocaust.
Given this idea that the Holocaust is not doesn't give the Jewish people special dispensation, so to speak, is it fair to say that they're guilty of hypocrisy for, in the wake of the Holocaust, treating the Palestinians in the manner that they are? Or does the Holocaust exonerate them to a degree? Is there any...
I don't think any suffering you endure exonerates you or gives you the right to inflict suffering on others. That doesn't make any sense to me. The usual relationship is that it's supposed to sensitize you to other people's sufferings, not give you the right to abuse other people. That doesn't seem to make much sense to me. And I don't think I would say much beyond that.
On July 4th in 1946, in the Polish town of, I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, Kielce, there was a pogrom where 37 Jews were killed, including many survivors of the death camps. The murders were instigated with the claim of the medieval claim of blood libel, this idea that Jews use the blood of Christian children in their rituals. And there were other acts of violence against the Jews in the post-war period, but the Kielce pogrom served, at least at the time, as a symbol for the necessity of a Jewish state. A lot of people who had returned to Poland and other parts of Europe used that as a reason. This is why we need a Jewish state. Do you think that Kielce and the subsequent conflicts between the Jews and the neighboring Arab states lend any legitimate credence to this idea that Israel and the Jews are eternal victims, that they have to have sort of a fortified state?
As I said, I think a reasonable person can make the argument that given what Jews endured during World War II would justify their claims on the state. I think you can make that argument. I happen not to agree with it, because I think the alternative of fighting for your rights within a state, the state you happen to reside in, is also an option. That was, for example, Gandhi's position. The Jews should have fought for their rights as equal citizens within the state that they reside in. But you can, I think reasonable people can say that as an alternative to fighting for the rights within your state, people might decide the struggle is futile or it's not worth it, and so we'd like to establish our own state. I could see that argument. But that is not really, that's not really the issue at stake here. The issue at stake here is, do those claims, do those historic and colossal historical injustices, do they justify the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population of an area? And I think the answer to that is plainly no.
Do you think the answer would have been different in the colonial period?
The answer might have been different in the colonial period, but that's just saying colonialism is wrong.
Okay. All right. I'd like to read you a quote from the book Explaining Hitler by Ron Rosenbaum. He's referring in this quote specifically to Claude Lanzmann. He's French, I hope I pronounced his name correctly. a Paris-based filmmaker who created the 9.5-hour film Shoah. It was released in 1985. Rosenbaum said, for Lanzmann, the attempt to explain Hitler is not merely futile, but immoral. He calls the very enterprise of understanding obscene. There are some pictures, and this is Lanzmann speaking, of Hitler as a baby too, aren't there? He said. There's even a book written about Hitler's childhood, an attempt at explanation, which is for me obscenity as such. Rosenbaum then said, one can sense why Lanzmann finds the impressionable plasticity of the baby pictures of a fatally alluring invitation, the deceptive and dangerous promise of understanding. I'm wondering, do you see any correlations between Lanzmann's characterization of Hitler explainers with those who address the question why, which is the question that's always repeated about the Holocaust, as obscene to the modern state of Israel's assertion that many of its critics are anti-Semitic?
Look, this is just nonsense. It's just meaningless and drivel. Plasticity of pictures. What do these terms mean? They're completely empty-headed. It's obscene to try to understand. Now, I understand that the documentary he produced was quite good. My parents liked it. I never watched it. But why is it obscene to try to understand why a phenomenon happened? Do you want to worship at it? Do you want to explain it? Or do you want to understand it in order to avert its repetition? To say you don't, trying to understand it is obscene. I'm afraid to say this is typical French intellectual drivel. And then these expressions, obscene as such. What does as such mean? It's just this pretentious twaddle. I don't know why people even pay attention to this. It's pseudo-profundity. Would you say of any other crime in history it's obscene to try to understand it? Oh, it's okay to try to understand Genghis Khan and Joseph Stalin, but it's obscene to try to understand Hitler. Why?
Do you think that attempt to characterize understanding as obscene has influenced the perception of criticisms of Israel today? For example, in Thomas Friedman's book,
because the whole purpose of this is to put the Nazi Holocaust in a category all its own. Everything else is understandable. The Nazi Holocaust is not understandable. Everything else we should try to rationally comprehend. The Nazi Holocaust, it's obscene to try to comprehend it. It's all designed to prove the uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust, and therefore the uniqueness of Jewish suffering, and therefore to exempt Jews in Israel from ordinary moral standards. It's a shakedown. It's moral extortion.
At the beginning of the presentation this evening, there was this statement that you grew up in a home that was hostile to war. I'd like to ask you a question about your parents, if that's okay. You're the son of two Holocaust survivors. Correct me if I'm incorrect, they were both in the Warsaw Ghetto. And your father survived Auschwitz and your mother Majdanek. Sorry, I didn't pronounce it correctly. How do you think they would see your perspectives of the Holocaust? Would they agree?
My parents lived until 1995, and I was already quite active politically on this issue since the very early 1980s, and there were no major disagreements. There probably would have been disagreements had they lived. Regarding my views of the Germans, I'm not prepared to categorize any group of people as being evil. And my parents, there was no love lost between them and the Germans or them and the Polish people. We probably would have disagreed, and probably would have disagreed strongly on that issue.
Anyone else have a question? That's all the questions I have.
Okay, that sounds fine.
It was a pleasure to speak with you, and it was also a pleasure to hear your lecture this evening.
Well, thank you.